Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox, and today we're talking about a topic that can be considered class reductionism. If you're someone who uses that term as a pejorative, let me start by assuring you I understand why. If your only concern is with class, with no awareness of racial, LGBT, or other forms of minority struggle, it's probably because you've oversimplified the world to a point that's unhelpful and absurd. In this video, I plan to do the opposite. I will be looking a bit more deeply for answers, but first, let me explain how this idea formed in my head in such a way that I realized that I had a solid video idea. I'm taking a course right now on building tiny homes, and the first week was focused on the concept of soft skills. For this, I had an excellent teacher, a black woman who has worked most of her life as either an HR rep or a social worker. So she's perfectly suited for this. As she talks about how to get along with coworkers and build a personal brand, I can't help but notice that she's socially liberal, but not in the least critical of capitalism. In fact, she seems to idolize Jeff Bezos. Ugh. This wasn't overt for the most part, though. In fact, she seemed to be clearly avoiding political topics to keep the peace. Now, I interpret many things politically. I have become accustomed to looking for unstated political messages. So often that my mind would take a relatively neutral thing she'd say and extrapolate it onto my knowledge of politics. And this led me to very interesting thoughts. First was a focus on looking for problems instead of problematic symptoms. This will be important later, so keep it in mind. That may seem obvious, however, it's a more common problem-solving mistake than you might think. The second was an idea that brought to mind the election. To quote her presentation as closely as I can, people have a problem with romanticizing the past, and this is known as the good old days syndrome. We have to accept that we can't turn back the clock and return to a previous point in history. We only have two real choices. We can make things better or we can make them worse. The reason just going back isn't feasible is because changes don't come easy. So if something has changed, it took a lot of people to change it, and there was a reason that they were motivated to do so. This reminded me both of the pitch for Trump 2016 and Biden 2020, and that got me thinking. The first of these thoughts is the usual, just another reason that Biden is blue MAGA. But the second idea is what I wanted to explain in this article. It starts with one question. Is socialism the solution to an epidemic of white supremacy? Before I can begin to answer, we have to figure out the problem we face here.
You can't solve a problem until you find out what's the root cause. And I want to find out what is the problem, what's going on.
To do that, we have to figure out why so many people are willing to join a movement and a president who has some blatant white supremacist messaging. Because I really believe that only a minority of Trump supporters are die-hard racists or fascists. I need to find the reason why a lot of generally decent white folks decided that these racist issues weren't a deal breaker. I don't want to demonize them. I want to try to understand them. Because otherwise, I don't believe that we can craft any solution to this problem that will work in the long term. It's my belief that this issue is deeply rooted in the class struggle that divides the poor rural whites in the areas of the country that came out in force for Trump in 2016. This wasn't the only reason for Trump's election, since a great many wealthy Americans voted for him as well because of the promise of lower taxes and deregulation. But I have little hope that we can change their minds. Many of these poor voters weren't the people who would typically vote, which I find interesting as well. My hypothesis is that many of these voters are sick of the systemic poverty they are made to endure, but don't know where to point the finger of blame since they lack an understanding of class analysis. Because of this, they're ready and willing to accept a scapegoat, and Trump was more than willing to give them one. The simple power of this was demonstrated in Weimar-era Germany after the economic collapse following post-World War I sanctions. The people sought out a scapegoat to explain their plight, and the Nazi Party gave them one. And this wasn't dissimilar to the way that Trump used race in 2016 and beyond. To these poor white Americans stuck in generational poverty, The phrase white privilege makes absolutely no sense. After all, they don't feel privileged. When your life and your family's lives begin and end in poverty with no wealth being accrued for the next generation, what do they have that makes them feel privileged? It's not like there are often many minorities in sight to use as a basis of comparison. Instead, they imagine chaos across the country in a faraway city like Chicago. As I said before, many of these people don't vote and generally view all politicians as equally corrupt, since nothing they could ever do seems to benefit their lives. With America's first 43 presidents being white men, they could also easily identify with their oppressors, but the election of Obama may have changed things. Now their symbolic oppressor was no longer white, like them. Now, they not only felt oppressed and poor, but they began talking more openly about white genocide, ethnocentrism, and generally adopting the language of victimization. What to them had been bearable under a series of white men whom they could imagine themselves becoming now felt intolerable under Obama. He didn't have to do anything worse than other American presidents for them to feel this way. I believe it arose from their continued and perilous economic insecurity. To be clear, I'm not saying that poverty equals racism, though there is at least an anecdotal correlation. What I'm saying is that if you're poor no matter what you do, you're far more likely to look for an explanation outside of yourself. This creates a fertile ground for racist ideas to incubate and spread, though there must be a vector, and that vector is the ideologically motivated racist. For the purpose of the rest of this video, let's call them true racists, and the larger mass of people simply racist sympathizers. Now, when I say racist sympathizer, I want to be absolutely clear that it's not my intention to downplay the negative effects that these people have on society. The rise of far-right propaganda in the age of Trump has led to a significant increase in hate crimes all over the country. People have died. Recently, in my hometown, Trump-supporting protesters brandished "Crack Lives Matter" signs. Even if you could consider the phrase "white lives matter" to be a perhaps intentional misunderstanding of the phrase "Black Lives Matter," there's absolutely no excuse for this sentiment. It is racist, it is deeply dehumanizing, and it will hurt people. It will lead people to more quickly pull the trigger when a black life is on the other end. This kind of Trump-era rhetoric has already been linked in a few separate studies to a dramatic increase in violent hate crime in the places where his base is the strongest. This is all without mentioning the way that his support of racism has massive systemic effects that make black lives so much harder. It's also worth pointing out that while I'm focusing on black communities in this particular essay, that the same could be said for many marginalized communities. We are committing human rights abuses against Hispanic immigrants. There's also a strong link between these sentiments and a willingness to accept anti-Semitism, and history has shown just how dangerous that can be for the Jewish community. While it may be accurate to attribute their motivation to their own economic problems, it does not excuse their willingness to commit these atrocities in the pursuit of a misguided attempt to better themselves. True racists have a deep connection to racism and they actively identify with it. They are on some level proud of being a racist, and often racism is a tradition that has been passed down to them culturally and traditionally. I depart from the class reductionism here. I do not believe that economic equality will rid us of true racists. True racists seek systemic power to shape the world to fit their awful views. What I do believe, however, is that it would do a lot to reduce the number of potential racist sympathizers at any given time. And these true racists wouldn't have much luck in gaining ground with their misinformation and carefully crafted propaganda if there wasn't a fertile new crop of sympathizers for them to herd behind them, giving them the political power to enforce their beliefs systemically. Here again, I must depart from the oversimplifications of class reductionism. This change to a socialist model won't solve racism outright. That being said, it will greatly reduce the resistance to progress that we must make in eliminating racism from our world. Because without sympathizers to rally behind them, true racists lose the power with which they have historically been able to oppose anti-racist movements. and to reinstitute newer and more covert forms of systemic racism every time we're able to claw back a bit of freedom from our oppressive systems. There's another question that we must tackle. Why does racism exist on a systemic level to begin with? In answering this question, we have to go back at least as far as the times of slavery. For a while, white slaves were being kept alongside black slaves, and their masters were in constant fear of revolt. These two groups of slaves had the common interest of escaping their bondage, and sometimes they came together to do just that. Their owners, who had outsized power in government — after all, this was an era in which only the white landowning males of America had the power to vote at all — began to codify laws that granted whites unique privileges not shared by their black counterparts. As black slaves began to be seen as more economical than white slaves as the Atlantic slave trade accelerated, plantation owners began to promote the white slaves into positions of authority over black slaves. They told them that they were better than their black brothers and sisters, and because of those differences, they deserved those privileges. While the children of white slaves were born free, the children of black slaves, often forced to breed or raped, were a free asset to their owners. Though slavery may have eventually ended, at least, outside of prisons, the dynamics established here continue to provide the same benefits, and what has really changed? We're still working for most of our lives in servitude to landowners, be they landlords or company owners, in hopes of earning enough to buy our freedom from the system. In this way, racism remains a beneficial tool to the wealthy elites, because if the working class is divided against itself, it's less likely to realize that the real divide is defined by class. Unable to ally with what they consider an other, or if they do achieve class consciousness, the lower class still has a major roadblock in unifying against their collective masters. This leads to the impotent wail, "I'm just a poor white trash motherfucker, nobody cares about me." And people like me have no power in the government. This can be further exploited through anti-government propaganda written by the elites to keep the poor from leveraging the one source of power that they have that could challenge the wealthy owners of the means of production.
Government is the one institution that people can change. That's exactly why all the anger and fear is directed against the government. The government has a defect. It's potentially democratic. Corporations have no defect. They're pure tyrannies. So therefore you want to keep corporations invisible and focus all anger on the government. If you don't like something, blame the government, not blame the guys in the Fortune 500, because you don't read the Fortune 500. You just read what they tell you in the newspapers.
Which explains why so much of anti-politics sounds exactly like anti-union propaganda. They want to control you, they're taking your hard-earned money. Anti-union laws are literally called right to work laws. Because if you can convince people that collective action is a threat to their freedom, that unions are a nightmare, and the government's your enemy, and you're better off on your own anyway, they're left with no real way to challenge corporate power. Or, to put it differently, if you can convince people that they're cowboys, they might not notice that they're actually the cows.
With this in mind, we can see that racism is simply a tool which the bourgeoisie uses to keep the workers from uniting in class consciousness and rising up against them, just like it always was. It's not a story you'd often hear about him, because his legacy has been whitewashed and clean of reference to class in our history books, but Martin Luther King once said the following within a speech.
You are put in the position of supporting your oppressor, because through prejudice and blindness, you fail to see that the same forces that oppress Negroes in American society oppress poor white people. And all you are living on is the satisfaction of your skin being white and the drum major instinct of thinking that you are somebody big because you're white, and you're so poor you can't send your children to school. You ought to be out here marching with every one of us every time we have a march.
Right now, white nationalism is an epidemic that's slowly becoming a pandemic as it spreads in country after country. I don't propose a socialist distribution of wealth and resources as a way of curing this disease. Instead, it's more like wearing a mask. It serves to help us get the spread under control so we can work on ridding our populace of it. I would also hope that we can see that socialism is perhaps the only movement which addresses the creators of our true racists, the wealthy elites. In attacking this problem from both sides, we have a chance to truly eradicate the causes of racism within our society, instead of just chasing after the symptoms and forcing the disease itself to come up with new ways to make the working class hate one another to benefit their economic security. What's more, I think that eliminating this feeling of insecurity gives us better ground on which to begin the work of weeding out these racist ideas. Right now, for the poor white Americans, poverty is an open wound. Naturally, this makes them feel as though they've been cornered and must be defensive. As I said before, under these conditions, hearing phrases like white privilege or sensitivity training will be met with mocking laughter at best and anger and derision at worst. Actually, the worst that could happen is for them to hear the words white privilege and say to themselves, "Sounds good, how do I get some of that?" This could even lead them to feel as though systemic racism is being done for their benefit. Despite the implication of the phraseology, though, it isn't. In an infamous 1981 interview, Republican strategist Lee Atwater said,
"You're talking about cutting taxes and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites."
When describing how he used benign political strategy to institute a new wave of covert systemic racism following the anti-racist victories of the civil rights movement. In the words, "blacks get hurt worse than whites," he admits two things. First is the racism inherent to the way Republicans redefine their party in response to the civil rights movement. He's also admitting that the very instruments he'd used to hurt black Americans would also hurt the whites, just not as much. Therefore, the only real white privilege to systemic racism is that they don't get hurt as bad, not that they aren't effective, much less affected positively. Perhaps this is something that we could explain to them as a form of deprogramming generations of racist thought. But a core idea of persuasion is that you cannot easily persuade someone who has become defensive. Eliminating income inequality would ease the motivation of this defensiveness. Or, as they explained it when I was working for a multi-level marketing company, it allows us to break down their barriers. Even better, creating greater income equality effectively undoes and rebalances many of the economic changes that people like Lee Atwater advocated for. This helps undo some of the systemic racism that's been established in the last few decades. However, we must recognize that we're fighting a system that has been building its power for centuries, not simply decades, and that we still have a long fight ahead. Still, it likely wouldn't be an uphill battle against the recurring enemy of white supremacy we've sadly gotten used to facing every few generations.
Just one more thing before I roll credits on this. I recently became aware of the No Comrades Under 1K sub, and I would just like to throw up on the screen some comrades that I'm subscribed to that have not yet reached 1,000 subs, but I really feel like they deserve it. So check these channels out, like their videos, give them a subscription, do what you can to help them out, share them on Facebook, whatever social media platforms you happen to be on, and let's try to build a stronger community together.
I'm Jackie Fox, and my content will always be ad-free because I'm eschewing corporate donations to the channel. I just ask that if you can donate a little bit of money on Patreon like these fine, foxy folks, or if you want to make a one-time donation, you can donate on Ko-fi. If you're looking for another way to support the channel, I'm also making Fox hats with my logo on them. They are currently in the design phase, and I'm willing to allow people to ask for customized hats. Prices may vary depending on the cost of labor to manufacture them, because I want to make sure that my workers are paid fairly.